Perfect. Thank you, Irvin. So good evening, everyone. My name is Brianna Doherty. I'm the Executive Assistant for the New Jersey Commission on Holocaust Education. Thank you for joining us this evening for this important discussion on addressing anti-Semitism in the wake of October 7th, 2023. The Commission is co-hosting this program tonight with 3 of the 30 amazing Holocaust Resource Centers here in New Jersey. With me, I have Dr. Asia Darbinia, Director of Change at Brookdale Community College, Avi Siegel, Director of Teen Initiative from the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West, and Irvin Moreno Rodriguez, Interim Director of the Sarah and Sam Schofer Holocaust Resource Center at Stockton University. The goal of tonight's program is to respond to questions from educators to ensure that they have the resources, materials, and information needed to appropriately discuss this topic in the classroom. We are joined tonight by Dr. Michael Berenbaum. Dr. Berenbaum is an award-winning filmmaker, writer, lecturer, consultant in the conceptual development of museums, and a renowned scholar of the Holocaust. He is the director of the Siggy Zuring Institute at the American Jewish University, where he is also a professor of Jewish studies and is here to respond to those questions that were pre-submitted to us earlier. Dr. Berenbaum, thank you for joining us tonight.
Okay, first of all, it's my pleasure to be with you. And I was born in New Jersey, so I have a kinship with New Jersey. I was born in Newark Beth Israel Hospital, which gives me some credibility with Metro West. I would say that about 50% of people in Metro West my age were also born in Newark Beth Israel Hospital. And I've been associated with Stockton for I think 24 years. So it's my home away from home. And my wife sometimes accuses me of having it be my home. Look, we're meeting at very serious and very difficult times. I thought that the questions I received were fabulous, and I want to be able to answer all questions, but I want to be able to present you a context with which you can understand what's happening at this moment in time. If I, and I should do this, but if I had a blackboard, I'm an antiquarian. My kids regard me as a Neanderthal. But if I had a blackboard, I would say, I'd like you to write down 4 words. I'd like you to write down source, goal, priority, society. Anti-Semitism as a phenomenon differs by its source. There is religious, political, economic, social, cultural, and racial anti-Semitism. Religious anti-Semitism means that you disagree and you find Judaism abhorrent. Political anti-Semitism means essentially you oppose a political agenda that includes Jews or has Jews. It's economic anti-Semitism. It's a different form. Social anti-Semitism, we used to call it in the last century, we used to call it 5 o'clock shadow, which is that we don't mind working with Jews, but we don't want to be with them after hours. We don't want them in our clubs, don't want them in our homes, don't want them in our social settings and the like. And one of the early responses to that is, in a very interesting way, the hospital that I was born in. Why was I born in Newark Beth Israel Hospital? Because at the turn of the 20th century, not the 21st century, Jewish doctors could not get jobs in most hospitals, and Jewish patients did not feel comfortable in most hospitals. Therefore, Jews established their own hospitals. They established their own country clubs because they were excluded from other country clubs. And that went by the wayside in the 1960s and 70s, and that type of social anti-Semitism and exclusion became illegal. There is racial anti-Semitism, which is the Holocaust, and with all due apologies to Whoopi Goldberg, the Nazis targeted the Jews because of their blood. Remember, the Nuremberg laws of 1935 said you were defined as a Jew based on the blood of your grandparents. It was a matter of biology, which is racism in its most intense. And in fact, you had a situation in which Jews were defined by people were defined by the state as Jews, even if they were Roman Catholic priests, Roman Catholic nuns, Protestant ministers whose grandparents had converted to Christianity, and the target was Jewish blood. That's source. Now, if you have different sources, it doesn't mean that sources don't combine. You can have political anti-Semitism and religious anti-Semitism. You can have economic anti-Semitism and religious anti-Semitism. Nazi racial anti-Semitism was the whole ball of wax, every type of different source. Second thing is the goal. If you have religious anti-Semitism, the goal of religious anti-Semitism is the conversion of Jews. If you have political anti-Semitism, we hear echoes of it in the statement, the Jews will not replace us. Political anti-Semitism meant that you want to diminish Jewish political power. You want to diminish those values that the Jews have fought for. And ultimately, political anti-Semitism can lead to exclusion or expulsion from societies. And we've seen that time again in human history. Economic anti-Semitism means for a period of time, there was what we call the glass ceiling. Economic anti-Semitism meant, for example, that in the old days, you had Sunday blue laws. You couldn't open your store on Sunday, which meant that a religious Jew who wanted to be closed on the Jewish Sabbath, which is Friday sunset to Saturday darkness, had to be closed Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And that was, in a very deep way, religious, was an economic penalty against the Jews. If you have social anti-Semitism, it means you want exclusion. The example of that used to be country clubs and hospitals and jobs, and also, for example, neighborhoods. And remember that one of the great achievements of America in the last century, and some of you may still have it on the deeds to your home. There are deeds to homes in which it says no Jews and no blacks. They would use the word Negroes at that point allowed. Those deeds have not changed, but the Supreme Court ruled that such exclusionary measures are unenforceable, and therefore they don't mean anything because you can't enforce them. Racial anti-Semitism, the goal of racial anti-Semitism under Nazism became first exclusion, and secondly, it became extermination, what we call annihilation, the murder of the Jews. The third component of anti-Semitism, remember I told you to take source, goal, priority. The reason Jews have been safe in the United States is not because there was no anti-Semitism, there was, but for two reasons. Number one, because we have freedom of religion, which is something that is granted to us from the Constitution. In fact, one of the elements that is unique to America, America and Israel are the only two societies in which Jews were never emancipated, because Jews had full rights from the beginning. We weren't excluded in that way. Priority means Jews have never been the first priority as targets of hatred. If each of you were to think for 30 seconds, and I'm going to give you 30 seconds, and say who is higher on the priority of targets than Jews in our society, you would come up with a whole range of people on that list. And I don't have to ask you to read the list, but we could come to a whole range of people who are higher targets on the list. And consequently, Jews were not the significant other, while in Europe during the Holocaust, Jews were the one significant other. They were the outsider. They were defined as such. And you can even hear it in language. The Nazis distinguished between Aryans and Jews. The Poles distinguished between Jews and Poles, even though Jews had lived in Poland for generation after generation, spoke the Polish language, contributed to Polish culture. If we were to say the same language in the United States, there are Americans and there are Jews, the entire Jewish community would rise in what? In absolute outrage. The last point, which is very important, is that essentially the rule of thumb is the more stable a society, the more secure its Jews, and the opposite is also the case. Jews are regarded as canaries in the mine. Why do you have canaries in the mine? Because essentially, if there is an absence of oxygen, the canaries are the first to know, and once they start singing in a mine, the miners know to what leave because there's trouble. If there is hate in society, if there is discrimination in society, if there is targeting in society, and if there's instability in society, the Jews are essentially going to be victimized. You can bet your bottom dollar on that. And consequently, they are an exemplar of that. Now, we as a society have gone through a series of crises. We had a health crisis. We all remember COVID-19 and what that did to education. It led to an economic crisis. It led to a social crisis. It led to a political crisis. We have a polarization. We have a crisis of fact. Daniel Patrick Moynihan once said, everybody's entitled to their opinion, but not to their set of facts. And we now have what? Alternate truths, fake news and false facts and all of that stuff, which means we have that type of division and we have polarization. Now, what is unique and unprecedented in our society, and even more so, not only for those of us who are teachers, but for the people that we teach, is that they have tools that are unprecedented in society. Number one, they have the internet, which is the equivalent of a megaphone, which gives you all sorts of sources of information, false, fake, untrue information, but it also means that you can broadcast hatred for almost no expense whatsoever worldwide. And we see the impact of that in anti-Semitic incidents. Example, and I don't want to use the word that sometimes they use in the news of manifesto. I want to use rant. The rant of the man who killed people in the church in Christ Crossing in New Zealand was dropped on the phones of students in the library at Syracuse University. That meant that a phenomenon becomes a global phenomenon. The killer of the 11 people worshiping on a Shabbat morning in the Tree of Life synagogue, the killer had gotten his information off the internet and acted accordingly. The second component is we now have social networks, and social networks mean that you can't isolate, you can't quarantine hatred, because essentially communities of fellow hatreds reinforce each other and essentially work together in that. And consequently, the social networks and also the whole range of things, that the tools that we have now assist the haters to create community, not to feel alone, to feel joined by a whole range of other people, to be in communication with each other, to be able to organize with each other. And all of that leads to an enormously combustible mix. Your students also find themselves bullied on social networks, isolated on social networks. And the other thing that we know is that in 250 or 264 characters, you can't create a complex argument. So everything becomes condensed into something without nuance, and people are not restrained in the expression of anger and hatred. And that's another component that we have in our society, which is that there is now a dramatic decrease in the social pressure not to express hatred, an increase where hatred is regarded as authentic and as tough and as strong and all of the like, which means that you don't have any social constraints. I can document for you that there was more anti-Semitism in thought, in numbers, in percentage of the population in the 1950s in the United States, but anti-Semites did not feel comfortable expressing their anti-Semitism in public because they felt that they would be identified with the Nazis, with the death camps, with those horrific pictures that we saw in 1945, 46, 47, and 48, with all that that represented. Let's talk for a moment about Israel and the like. Israel imagined itself and was created as a rational solution to anti-Semitism. We'll talk a little bit later about Zionism, but political Zionism said, we want to make Jews a normal people, a people like any other people, a people with a land, a language, a country, a flag, and an army, and that army would keep the Jewish people safe in their land. That ironically seemed like it would work for a while. If we go back, to example, to the early 1990s, we found something remarkable. The Jewish community was worrying, what are we going to do without anti-Semitism when there's no barrier to assimilation into society? Is there enough to keep the Jews together if everybody wants to welcome us and accept us? Whole areas were dealing with, what do we do about internal life? Forget about community relations, forget about anti-Semitism. The Anti-Defamation League is old news, and we don't have anti-Semitism as a problem. We have seen over the past 50 years that Israel cannot only quench the flames of anti-Semitism, but it can fuel the fires. And then we have a euphemism that is used by some, and that's to be differentiated between support for opposition to policies of the state of Israel, to opposition to the entity of the state of Israel, with the term anti-Zionism being a substitute for anti-Semitism or anti-Jews. Now, let me just state it, and then we'll take two questions. There are three ways to distinguish between anti-Zionism and to say, when is it that anti-Zionism morphs into anti-Semitism? If you have all three, you see it dramatically. If you have any one of the three, you see it a little bit together. And there are three Ds: double standards, delegitimation, and demonization. If you judge Israel by one standard, everybody else by another standard, then you're dealing with moving toward anti-Semitism. If you say Israel occupies territory that once had a native population, which it excluded, it pushed aside, it sent into exile, or it put into refugee camps and the like, well, the same is, and therefore it has no right to exist. Therefore, you would have to say, if you use the same standard, the United States has no right to exist, Canada has no right to exist, Australia has no right to exist. There are 27 such countries that we can point to immediately to say they therefore would be illegitimate and the like. And the final is when you identify Jews with demonization and Israel with demonization. Israel is the source of all evil, poisoning the wells, using Palestinian children to harvest their organs. Any of those issues becomes an element of Israel is demonic. It's not only wrong, and every human institution is on more than one occasion wrong, but it's demonic, and that's pushing toward anti-Semitism. Brianna, that's an introduction. I'm from New York originally, even though I was born in New Jersey, which means I talk fast. And I hope that I've been clear. Now let's take questions, and you'll put them to me.
Yes,
One,
absolutely. That was perfect. Thank you so much. Um, the four of us have questions, and then we'll just kind of go around. I'll start, and then we'll just move on to the next. So the word anti-Semitism does not carry the same meaning with young people as it does with educated adults. How do we connect historical anti-Semitism with modern examples, for example, the Tree of Life and October 7th, etc., so that our students connect the past with the present and internalize the lessons we should learn from anti-Semitism when and wherever it occurs in the world?
okay. We have a problem we have a problem that's emerged over a long period of time. Number one, we don't know how to spell anti-Semitism. And that is, some spell it ANTI hyphen and then a capital SEMITISM. And some spell it, most scholars now spell it as one word. And the reason we don't spell anti-Semitism with a hyphen and a capital is because there's nothing quite like Semitism. And if you speak anti-Semite with a hyphen and a capital, some people argue I can't be anti-Semitic, I'm a Semite, and that also doesn't mean it. Anti-Semitism, and we have a fight over the definition of anti-Semitism that's prevalent in the world. There is a definition offered by something called IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is an international body of multiple countries that chooses to remember the Holocaust and the like. They came out with a working definition, which gets refined. There is also called the Jerusalem Declaration, which tries to say that there are certain forms of criticism of the state of Israel that are not inherently anti-Semitic. And consequently, they have a different. Anti-Semitism is essentially an unwillingness to accept Jews as part of the general family of humanity, and to take specific targets against Jews, religious, political, social, economic, racial, in all of that dynamics. And we have to see that anti-Semitism is, and your students will understand, it's whack-a-mole. It's a whack-a-mole in which you knock it down in one place, it pops up at another. Let me give you an example. If you say there's a crisis at the border, everybody can agree to that. If you say there's an invasion at the border sponsored by George Soros, that comes close to and probably touches the line of anti-Semitism. You're talking about a 91-year-old man who seems to have all the power to create the circumstances in South America that are economic, political, and even law enforcement wise, that force people to come here desperate to seek a new life. An invasion is an act of an army, and you say that one 91-year-old can somehow do it. If somebody else says that the Rothschilds have set the fires aflame in the forest fires of California by laser beams from outer space, which was said by a distinguished congressperson, then you're also dealing with somebody who's embedded and embodied the notion of the protocols of the elders of Zion, where Jews somehow control everything that happens in the world. So anti-Semitism takes on different forms, but it's a whack-a-mole. See the different forms that it takes, and see that the way in which they relate in a variety of ways. Let's also say, because many of us teach the Holocaust, what happened on October 7th is not the Holocaust. It was a pogrom. And the reason it's not the Holocaust in part is because it was done differently for different purposes to a people that had a different type of ability to respond to what happened, which bears no resemblance to the Holocaust. Remember, the Holocaust evolved over 12 years. It ultimately involved 22 countries. It was done by the most powerful government in the world with the most advanced philosophy and literature and art and music all the way through. and it was a priority for that state that evolved over 12 years. This was something else. And what we saw, though, is that even though the materiality of what happened was awful, horrific, terrible, it far more resembled a pogrom. The only thing it shares in common was the venom, the anger, the fury, because here you had the murdering of men, women, and children. You had the violation of women and all of that. Let's go with the next question. And if I haven't answered the question, give me a follow-up, Brianna, and wrap my knuckles.
You're good. Irvin, do you want to ask your first question?
Thank you, Dr. Berenbaum. We have a question from an educator. Besides someone bringing up a speaker or the topic in class, what more can we do to bring awareness to modern anti-Semitism to our students?
You know, one of the things we have to do is I think we have to reduce all forms of hate speech, of which anti-Semitism is one. That's not to dodge particular attention to anti-Semitism, but to say that it occurs in the context in which society for a long period of time has been deeply angry one at another and not deeply supportive of one another. So I think the first thing that we can say is, that type of action, speech, or behavior is hurtful. And it bears an echo. And one of the language that you can use this language educationally, you can say it echoes. It mirrors, it suggests, does a variety of things, much easier than saying that's anti-Semitic. It echoes an anti-Semitic trope. An anti-Semitic trope which said X, Y, and Z. And I'm certain you didn't intend it that way, but that's the way in which it can be heard. Very different than accusing somebody is to call particular attention to them for that.
Perfect. Thank you. Avi, did you want to ask your first question?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Berenbaum, again for being with us. In terms of iconography, right? Whereas in your last comment, you made a point that you can dialogue and speak to people. How do we support our learners that are seeing anti-Semitic graffiti being sprayed across their schools, their lockers, their gymnasiums, their bathrooms, ranging from swastikas to from the river to the sea? What happens when it becomes a part of their ecosystem, but it isn't a face or a voice behind it?
Look, let's take a swastika. If a swastika is drawn, and I have to tell you that in 1969, I had a swastika painted in blood over my bed in a political dispute. So I can tell you how horrible that feels. Somebody entered my home, came to the bed in which I had, I slept, and painted in blood. Could have been red paint, by the way. It appeared blood-like, as it were, a swastika. My response to a swastika would be to say, number one, the Nazis murdered millions of people. They gassed men, women, and children. They tried to exterminate an entire part of their population. They victimized multiple groups. They were the opponents, the enemies of the United States of America. And I'm not certain you want to identify with that. We went to war against the Nazis because we thought what they were doing was repugnant, repellent, and we thought that their defeat was essential to the survival of the Western world. Do you really want to be identified with that? Do you understand what you're doing? Do you understand why we regard the swastika as hostile and why we regard it as abhorrent? We regard it as abhorrent in the same way we regard saying the N-word as abhorrent, in the same way we regard, as it were, if you put up a rope to echo the lynching as abhorrent. There are certain things in society that trigger a furious response of those who want to oppose those who hate. And I don't believe somebody who draws a swastika, I don't believe most people who draw a swastika want to be identified with the totality of what represented by the swastika. I presume that they think that they're being cute and defiant. They're, going like that. It's much more than going like that. And I think once you explain that, that has a certain capacity. And if somebody says, I love what the Nazis did, then there's no possibility of dialogue.
Thank you, Dr. Berenbaum. Asya, do you want to ask your first question?
Sure, thank you. Dr. Berenbaum, since you talked about the importance of understanding the terms that we use when we call certain events as they happen. You mentioned about October 7 as a pogrom and not a Holocaust. Another term that now is being discussed also at an international stage is genocide. And we are getting this question from high schools, from college campuses. Would you please share your thoughts about the South Africa's genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice?
So you asked such a simple question. It's easy and the like. Let me begin a couple of ways. Let's deal with the international case. And I say this with fury, that there are certain statements that have been made by people who are in leadership in Israel that use genocidal terms. One idiot suggested that the Gaza Strip be nuclearized, be nuked. And with all due respect, if you nuclearize the Gaza Strip, you'd also make Israel uninhabitable because of radiation, but he wasn't smart enough to realize that. Some people believed that we should starve them into attrition, and starvation is not acceptable. Others say, let us push them out and not allow them. Let's kick them out of Gaza. And another one said, let's resettle Gaza, and then we have to deal with the anti-colonialists. So there is evidence of a desire on the part of some in Israel to perform deeds that are abhorrent, that come close to, in language, suggesting genocide. We oppose those. They are terrible, they are horrible, they're miserable, they should be what? They should be responded as repugnant. That's not the policy of the government of Israel and what is called the War Cabinet, which is ruling Israel. Let's also say Israel has the capacity to inflict genocide. It has the opportunity to inflict genocide. Meaning capacity means it has overwhelming use of force, overwhelming capacity of force. It has the capability of doing it, and it has the excuse if it wanted to do it. The language that's being used in Israel is that they are opposing at war with Hamas, not at war with the Palestinian people. And they're deliberately using that. That's a great distinction. They're opposed to a political force that is governing, whose charter is not only anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, but is explicitly calls for the annihilation, the elimination of the state of Israel and the attack on all Jews. And consequently, if there is genocidal intent, if Hamas had its way, they might perform genocide. Israel has been restrained in not doing those things. That does not mean that you have, and we have a problem today, and I'm an expert on it, and the world's greatest expert happens to live in New Jersey, and that's Michael Walzer, who's at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. The question is whether we now have what is called a just war. And the question is whether a just war can be fought given the conditions that we have in a manner of justice. and Israel struggles to do that, mostly succeeds, and sometimes fails. Let me give you a terrible example. And when I say this, I am pained and chagrined. If we take the figures that Gaza has used and the figures that the Israelis have used, the Gazans claim under Hamas that 23,000 people have been killed. I don't know if the figure is accurate or not. It's irrelevant. The Israelis claim that they've killed 8,000, essentially 8,000 Hamas fighters, 8,000 and a number of people. If that is the question, then it appears that the ratio of civilians killed to combatants killed is about 2-1. If that is the case, that is dramatically different than, for example, the behavior that we saw in Mosul, the behavior of the American army in a variety of things. If you look at the history of warfare and you forget any moral issue and you forget your compunction, your moral conscience as to what you're seeing, and I never want to forget that, then the ratio of 2-1 is not bad for a military, even though every life of a civilian that is lost is terrible, tragic, and difficult. But the conditions that Israel faces are conditions imposed by Hamas, which set up its infrastructure in the heart of neighborhoods, built tunnels under hospitals, schools, and mosques, and UN resettlement areas, which meant that if you wanted to, and presumed that the world would stop Israel after a brief period of time because of the magnitude of the loss. I want to say that we had a ceasefire on October 6th, and that ceasefire was broken. And consequently, what we have is war, a difficult war with too many civilian casualties, in part because of the infrastructure that's been imposed. And my heart breaks for that. And I hope that we can eventually find a horizon for the Palestinians to realize their rights and their national aspirations. But I have to say this, and it's not going to make anybody very happy. Only a confirmed anti-Semite could believe that the people of Israel have the government that they deserve. And only a confirmed anti-Semite could believe that the people of Palestine have the leadership that they deserve. And only a confirmed anti-Palestinian could believe that the people of Palestine have the leadership that they deserve, and that the people of Israel, and only a confirmed anti-Semite could believe that the people of Israel have the Palestinian leadership that they deserve. Why? Because we had an opportunity in 1947, in 2000 and 2007, to have a Palestinian state. If we had agreed in 1947 to the partition of land, we would now have an Arab state that would be 76 years old. If there was an agreement between Bill Clinton, Ehud Barak, and Yasser Arafat in 2000, we'd been in the 23rd year of a Palestinian state. If there was an agreement with Ehud Omer and Mahmoud Abad, we'd now be in the 16th year or 15th year of a Palestinian state. And the reality, the tragic reality, is that Palestinians have not lost an opportunity, in the words of Abba Eban, to lose an opportunity. And given this government in Israel, they have not provided a reasonable political off-ramp for the Palestinian people. And that's why this is a catastrophe and a tragedy. And one could say not a comedy of errors, but a catastrophe of errors going on 76 years.
Thank you, Dr. Berenbaum. With what is happening in Israel and Palestine being so prevalent on social media in the news, we're seeing younger and younger students coming into the classroom asking questions. So in your opinion, how should we address this to like elementary school students, to those that younger generation?
Let me begin by saying I feel ashamed to have bequeathed this world to our students. I belong to the generation that went through the Civil Rights Revolution. I had the opportunity to march with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we thought we were going to, and I was a classmate of Andrew Goodman, one of the three young men who was killed in Mississippi in 1964. What were they doing? They were registering Black voters in Mississippi right after the civil rights laws were passed and the right to vote was there. So I lived at a time when we were enormously hopeful that we could achieve great goals of inclusion and the extension of human rights and human dignity to all of the American population. And we also lived in the 1990s to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the birth of democracy. And it looked like the world was going to become what? A much more wonderful place to live. And then we look at the world today, and the first response has to be, oi. Whoa. Terrible, tragic, bad. Having said that, and in one sense, part of education and part of raising a child today is to tell them a half truth or a half lie. The first thing we tell them is the world is safe and we are here to protect you. And they quickly learn at some point that the world is unsafe and there is a limit to parental protection or school protection. So part of what we can do to a child is to essentially say, we are creating for you as secure an environment as we can create in a world that has a lot more hatred than we'd like to live in. And we're suffering with precisely the same anguish that you are, even through a little bit more sophisticated lens. And part of what we don't want you to lose is that innocent sense of what social justice and fairness should represent. Remember, one of the arguments kids use most of all is it's not fair, right? I once had, I laugh about that. I once had a miserable boss who was unkind to everyone. And when the workers, the employees got together, we came to the conclusion, the one thing we had to say is that he was equally unfair to everybody. And we could not accuse him of racism or sexism or anti-Semitism. He was equally miserable to everybody, which only united us in a very real way. So we have to reassure a student in part by creating an environment in which things can be, not ideas be safe, but the environment itself be intellectually safe and open and supportive. And that's our task as educators. And the reason I distinguish between that and ideas is that one of my experiences in school, and I think it's more in high school than elementary school, is that sometimes I came across ideas that changed my opinion of things and shook up my world and didn't necessarily reinforce my commonplace. So I want ideas to be upsetting, but the atmosphere to be accepting. I want ideas to be challenging, but the atmosphere to be embracing. And I think we can do both in a classroom if we're skilled. And Lord knows that teaching at this time in history is not easy. And we all go into this because we're overpaid and underworked, but we get other rewards for the work that we do, and the work that we do is enormously important. And let me add as a thing, look, your biggest argument with the students is we live now in a knowledge-based economy. And the most important thing I want you to learn in my class is how to learn. And the most important thing I want you to come away with is your capacity, where you say I can learn, because most of you will work in a field that doesn't exist today with tools that don't exist today. And therefore you have to have confidence that you have the capacity to learn, and I'm here to help you get those skills.
That's great. Thank you. Avi, do you want to ask your next question?
Absolutely. Talking a little bit about the partnership between education outside the school, outside of home, and education in the home. We had an educator pose the question that their students actually have a home that's divided right now, where the information coming in is not unified, but giving information, narratives, and sources for both sides of the conflict. How do educators help navigate and balance, right, when home in itself is often divided and polarized for some of our learners?
Well, there's an interesting thing in family dynamics. In family dynamics, usually one person is the peacemaker. We usually call that the middle child. And that is that homes themselves are polarized, and homes themselves are an alternate source of information. And we often say, where do people learn hatred, and where do people learn racism, and where do people learn anti-Semitism? A child is not born hating. Consequently, they have to either learn it from their home, or learn it from society, or learn it in the environment in which they live, or, God forbid, learn it in school. So consequently, we have to be careful, and I think we have to be meticulous in laying out facts and in challenging without disparaging things that you believe are inappropriate and false. If most of the young people are getting their information from TikTok and X and Facebook and the like, they're not getting it from a credible source, or there's everything out there. Some will they're getting it from multiple sources, not all of which can be credible because they have conflicting ideas. I lived in a generation that when Walter Cronkite told you something, you believed it. Now we live in a generation when the president of the United States says it, immediately somebody else gets on the news conference, says he's lying. Not that he's got a misjudgment or whatever, but he's a liar. And you also have the whole industry of fact checker because of the divisions that we have. And this is a very difficult environment. And school is so perfect that we do terrific without parents. And parents, especially some who homeschool, said we are so perfect that we do very well without school. And the reality is there has always been a tension between what is learned at home and what is learned in school. And kids live in a much more challenging environment with regard to their home environment than they did. Many more are in single parent homes. Many more are in homes in which there are tensions and difficulties, and some are in homes that mirror the divisions that we have in the United States, and we have that as well.
Thank you. Asia, do you want to ask your next question?
Make it easy, this one. I'm scared of you.
Well, I'm going to follow up on this question about classroom versus home, since a number of questions that we got from educators were about how many different types of messaging students get, and then when they go home, it's a very different environment there. It doesn't matter how safe or secure environment was created in classroom. But you mentioned about this as well, but can you please discuss any suggestions, ideas, or actions that can help influence or educate the broader community about the sensitive topics, so that there is less of a almost fear of what's going to happen after the student leaves the classroom and goes, to home or.
I'll tell you something. Occasionally, I think schools should do certain things that are bold, like have a session for parents and children. Years ago, there was a wonderful movie called Into the Arms of Strangers. It was about the Kinder transport, the attempt in 1938 and 39 to bring 10,000 German, Austrian, and Czech children who were in danger to be resettled in England. And I wrote the, what shall we call it? I wrote the student guide for that. And I said, if you could do it, one of the things I would like you to do is to invite parents to see the movie with children. Why? Because the axis of that movie was the parental-child bond. Remember, the Kinder transport meant that the parents had to love their child so much and believe that, understand, perceive that they were in danger and they could not protect their child, and love the child that much that they could bear to be separated from them. And the child, we found, which was very interesting, is intellectually they understood that their parents had saved them and allowed them to live because they got them the hell out of Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, the Czech Bohemian Moravia, just in time, and they would have ended up, as many of the parents were, in concentration and ultimately even in death camps, etc. But their parents loved them so much that they gave them away, but they sent them into the arms of strangers, which for the kids was abandonment. And when I reviewed the film the first time, I said, it's a film that gives you no respite, because you're either pained as a parent, what is the moment that I would be willing to give my child away? My child away? Inconceivable to those of us who live in freedom. And then as a child, what is the moment at which your parents would be willing to give you away in order to save your life? And then there was even no happy ending, because some of the parents did not survive, never saw their children again. And some of the children, when they saw their parents again, their parents had seen them as a 9-year-old. They didn't know how to deal with a 17-year-old who was living on their own for 8 years. And the parents themselves were no longer the same people. When you're 9 years old, you think your parents are the strongest people in the world, etc. They were broken by what they had experienced. And your first instinct at the end of the movie is to hug your kid and hug your parent. And I wanted parents and children to go through that experience together, because what it led in my house when we saw it was talk about not only about the Holocaust, but the intensity of the parent-child bond and what it meant. So there are moments at which we should be bold enough to try to educate parent and child. And therefore, and one of the things also that we used to have, and it was very interesting, when we did a study of Holocaust curricula 44 years ago. And we had a very interesting thing. People used to come home and they would ask their parents or their grandparents, where were you? And what did you do? And we found something very interesting, that the best measure of how effective the education was that kids brought it home. Because sometimes, I don't know about your kids, but sometimes I ask my kids, how did it go in school? Okay. What do you learn in school? Ah. And, what was interesting? Nothing. When your kid comes home and says, I want to talk about this with you, that means what? You've registered something to them. And by the way, that was also true, for example, in Germany as well, where they were looking at their parents or grandparents with a question of, where were you, which was an accusation very often, and that led to a discomfort. So we found, ironically, that even where parents were protesting Holocaust education, the reason they were protesting is because they knew their kids were getting a Holocaust education, because they brought it home. In the same way that sometimes if your kids read a book that touches them in a very deep and profound way, they'll bring it home as well. But they were bringing this home because it was important and tough. So we have to try to reach out in a variety of ways to parents, and also to, in one sense, help the schools by creating a better environment outside the schools as well.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one last question. Irvin, did you want to ask your last question?
Thank you, Brianna. Dr. Berenbaum, we spent a good portion of today's webinar talking about the past and the present, but I want to focus a little bit on the future. How do we reconcile with our friends, family, neighbors post-war? Is reconciliation possible after witnessing such bold forms of anti-Semitism and other forms of hate here in the United States?
That's a wonderful question. One thing, and I want to add a question: is reconciliation possible, and when is reconciliation possible? I want you to notice something in contemporary events which is unimaginable and unpredictable. The country that is defending Israel in the International Court of Justice is Germany. I mean, it's astounding. Instead of doing what lots of enemies of Israel want to do, look, we were Nazis, you're now Nazis. So Nazism must not be all that bad, because look at you, you're Nazis. Germany is the country that's defending Israel, International Court of Justice. And they're saying, we know genocide, we committed genocide. Reconciliation also, there's been a dramatic reconciliation with the transformation over 60 years of the Vatican and the Jews. In one sense, if you look at the history of Christian anti-Semitism, you say the following, that the John the 23rd, Pope John the 23rd, now Saint John the 23rd, learned anti-Semitism and transformed the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church regarding the crucifixion. Jews are not responsible for the crucifixion of Christ. Human sin is, if Christ died for our sins, no sins, no crucifixion. John Paul II, not his immediate predecessor, but his predecessor once removed, who is now Saint John Paul II. John Paul II reconciled with Israel by recognizing it politically, went to the Western Wall and put a kvittel, a letter in the wall saying the following. He apologized for the anti-Semitism of Christians, and he said something that no pope had ever said before: anti-Semitism is anti-Christian. And now his successor, once removed, Pope Francis eliminated the mission to the Jews and said what? And said that the Jews are at one with God. The New Testament has not come to replace the Old Testament. He got rid of replacement theology. Jews are in their original covenant with God. It has come to enhance, intensify, broaden, etc., etc. So we've seen massive elements of reconciliation. We saw reconciliation, by the way, in South Africa, when you got you had Mandela, who came out of prison not hating, and who was interested in reconciliation. And what was the commission called? Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we know from history that reconciliation is possible. We hope that reconciliation is possible, not in a matter of decades, but in a matter of months and years. And here also we have a very interesting example, which is, look how quickly over time the United States made peace with the German people while not making peace with Nazism. After having fought a war in which millions were killed over precisely the question of Nazi Germany. So reconciliation is possible. We've seen it historically. The question is when. And look, we can say it in one sense, the Yom Kippur War, whose 50th anniversary we had in 2023, October 6th, 2023, and this all occurred October 7th. The Yom Kippur War, 4 years later, Anwar Sadat went to Jerusalem. So history does have the capacity to surprise. Which is why I'm much better, Irvin, as an analyst of the past than I am as a predictor of the future. Some of you might even say I'm not a good analyst of the past, but I'm certainly a better analyst of the past than I am a predictor of the future.
No, that was great. Thank you very much. So that's the end for us tonight. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I know we did get a lot of questions, and we'll work on addressing those and getting answers for those that submitted questions. But thank you all for joining us. In the next few days, I will be sending out some additional resources for everyone that registered, resources and materials that can be helpful when addressing this in the classroom. And I will also be sending out professional development certificates to those that requested it. Again, thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, Dr. Berenbaum and Dr. Darbinian, Avi, Irvin. Thank you guys, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
And thank you for your questions. I appreciated them enormously. Good night.
Good night.